Okay. I'm Savannah, and I will be refuting Clarissa Esperanza's claim of fact speech. And yeah, we've already heard one of that. So she proposed, her main claim was that she proposed that the media's portrayal of Mexican Americans has a negative effect on how people view them. And I agree with her claim because I am a Mexican American, and I am nothing like the stereotypes that she proposes and that is portrayed in the media. So Clarissa stated 3 secondary claims. 1, the media stereotypes Mexicans. 2, the media fails to show the diversity of Mexican cultures. And 3, the media underrepresents Mexican occupations shown in entertainment. Although I agree with these claims, I don't agree with the evidence used to support them. In Clarissa's first claim that the media stereotypes Mexicans, her use of evidence, South Park, fails to show justification because it is a satire. South Park is not a credible source because not only does it make fun of Mexicans, but equally every other race and religion. South Park is intended for mature audiences because it is a comedy and not a literal view of the world. If all episodes contain nothing but backlash toward the Mexican culture only, this source could be more of a reliable one. And I have evidence from David Carr from the New York Times published that South Park, the comedy series, is an animated show that tries its best to push buttons and the boundaries of freedom of speech by mocking every high-profile target in sight, from Hollywood celebrities to religious figures. So this brings me to her second secondary claim, and she states that the media fails to show the diversity of Mexican cultures. I had a really hard time figuring this one out because this statement shows it fails to show Mexican diversity, and it's kind of worded wrong. In my opinion, I think she is mistaking Mexican in this case for Latino or Hispanic. Latin America contains numerous Latino cultures. Mexican cultures is one of these subgroups and is diverse to the other Latin cultures. So Mexicans are not diverse, but rather a shared group of beliefs and traditions. Whether we act on them or not does not make Mexican culture any more diverse. So to give you an example of this, because I am a Mexican American, I partake in many of the traditions, like when I had a quinceañera at 15, but not every Mexican American girl does this. And those Mexican Americans who do not have quinces do not make the Mexican culture any more diverse. They just do not partake in certain traditions. So when saying that Mexican culture does not show the diversity of Mexican cultures, Mexican culture is not diverse in that way. It's one specific culture, but just certain people do not partake in the traditions, and that's what makes it, that doesn't make it diverse. So in her last secondary claim, she states that the media underrepresents Mexican occupations shown in entertainment. Because again, she uses Family Guy, a satire, as a source, it weakens her argument. These shows are for entertainment purposes only, and in this claim, she also states that they portray Mexican Americans to have accents, which I didn't see as a wrong portrayal. This claim may be very much true. I don't see how having an accent is a bad thing though. Those whose first language is not English may have an accent when speaking English. Many Mexican Americans' first language is Spanish, and when they do speak English, they may have an accent, but it doesn't seem like a strong enough argument to negatively portray Mexican Americans. So in conclusion, I would like to clarify that I do agree with Clarissa's claim, but the evidence and examples that she uses weakens her argument. Thank you.
All right, I've got to be honest. If it didn't make it clear before, let me point out now. When you're making these arguments, whenever you're engaged in arguments, of course, obviously you were motivated in your own arguments by the position or the point of view that you have. When we're adopting this model for learning processes, I got to frankly say your personal views on the subjects aren't really relevant. And if you were the defense attorney presenting in front of a jury and you said, well, my client is guilty, but let me show you how they didn't really prove that he's guilty, I don't think you would be helping your client's case. And in fact, you'd be guilty of malpractice in that particular situation. You don't have to accept the premise. Once you've accepted the premise, we no longer have a dispute. Now the only dispute is whether or not the evidence that they used is adequate, and you've changed the nature of the argument, and so we've got a different claim we're arguing about. The claim we're arguing about now isn't whether or not the media is biased, it's whether or not the advocate used adequate evidence to prove that the media is biased, and that's a different issue. And you're not, like I said, we don't have a conflict anymore. It goes back to the first thing we talked about on conflict. It's got to be an express struggle between these two interdependent parties. Now, for the purpose of the model in here, we have to kind of imagine that that's the situation that you're in. So I think you want to refrain from doing that. And I don't need to just point to you. Anybody else in this situation, when we get into these debates, for example, down the road, I don't want anybody standing up and saying, well, I think that we ought to do what they're talking about, but I'm going to go ahead and say why we shouldn't do it anyway. I don't think that helps you at all. The point is to find the arguments on the other side. Now, on the arguments on the other side that you did find, the main issue that you're presenting, again, is the challenge to the evidence. I thought that you had a reasonable challenge to the satire evidence from South Park and Family Guy. I think that's acceptable. You do talk about how those programs are designed deliberately to provoke a response, which means that they probably are not generalizable and not typical and representative of what the media's opinion is. In fact, they get heavily criticized for doing the very thing that the advocate says that the media is doing. And so I think that by picking those examples, they actually undermine their claim. On the second point, I think you get a little involved in this discussion about diversity of cultures and whether or not the Mexican culture has any diversity to it. How important is that to the advocate's argument? I don't know. And I think that that's one of those things at the end where you've spent a lot of time on this and you have to have a clearer explanation of the impact of this argument. If it's correct that she's conflating Latin culture with Mexican culture and that's the problem, okay, then why does that give us a problem? Does that mean that the media is really they've got their brown glasses on and they can't see the difference between any cultures whatsoever? Or does that mean that the Mexican culture deserves a distinct identification separate from the other Latin cultures? I don't know. And I'm not sure that the argument advanced the advocate's claim much, and I'm not sure that it helps you in responding to the advocate's claim very much. And then I thought that you did have a good response on the third point when you're talking about the accents, and I'm not sure how that's relevant in establishing that there's a negative impression of people because they have an accent. The fact that the truth of the matter is all of us have accents. We just don't think we have accents until we go someplace else and somebody says, gee, where are you from? And you say, California. I knew you were from someplace else because you got such a great accent. You go, I don't know what you're talking about. You're the one with the accent. It's always a matter of perspective on this, and I think that's one of the things that you did a nice job pointing out, at least when it comes to the ESL issue. All right, thank